Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast. My name is Paul Ellis, and I'm your host for these programs about developments in this fast-growing industry. Today, we're exploring the evolving role of ESG data in sustainable finance, examining its influence amid the current ESG backlash, and discussing its potential to shape a future focused on accountability, trust, and meaningful impact. My guest is Lise Pretorius, Chief Sustainability Analysis Officer at Matter, which offers ESG and sustainability data and analytic solutions to the investment industry. Our conversation highlights the shift from opaque ESG ratings to key design principles for meeting regulatory demand and stakeholder expectations. Hello, Lise, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast.
Hi, Paul. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you join us today, and we have a lot of information to cover, so we're going to jump right into the questions. The first one is, let's begin our conversation today with a brief description of the new types of data being used to supplement company disclosures, including forward-looking analysis, geospatial data, and third-party insights.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, so ESG data has really gone through an evolution in the last couple of years, and it may be useful to look at the questions that we need to answer with ESG data for sustainable finance to be really effective, and the way that this new type of data is helping us answer those questions. So if we assume that investors are using data to be informed, basically how to shift capital towards more sustainable outcomes or towards companies managing sustainability risks better, then we need to know a couple of things. So we need to know, what type of company is it? A tech company needs to worry more about things like privacy and security. A mining company needs to worry about things like water. We then need to know, do they have the right policies, management systems, governance in place to manage these issues? And then something around performance. And these are usually quantitative metrics like CO2 emissions or water use. Now, that's what we've always had available in ESG data, but it's been missing some gaps to answer some really critical questions. So one is that historical ESG data has had a bit of a time lag, so it's backward looking. It's usually got about 1 or 2 years time lag before it hits the hand of investors. The second is that it's been lacking context. So we can't say, for a given water consumption disclosure, is this good or bad for this company based on where it's operating, for example? So we need context. Forward-looking data, we need to know, is a company's emissions performance good or bad in relation to how it needs to decarbonize over time? And then we've also been lacking alignment with kind of best practice expectations when it comes to deforestation, human rights, some of the critical issues. And so the data that is coming out now is really about filling those gaps and answering these questions. So when it comes to timeliness, we're now seeing things like geospatial measurements of emissions in real time from factories, for example, which we can triangulate with company disclosures, or deforestation in real time, which we can triangulate with deforestation disclosures. On context, we can look at things like, is a company's climate strategy that it's disclosing in line with what it is required in the future to align with net zero, rather than just today. And when it comes to aligning with multi-stakeholder standards, I think, and best practice international standards, this is really where triangulating with multi-stakeholder institutions, third-party subject matter experts in their fields becomes really interesting, because we can say, okay, a company has disclosed something on a deforestation policy. What does WWF say about whether this meets best practice deforestation management? Or a pharma company may say something about its pricing strategy, and then Access to Medicine Foundation can tell us something about whether this is in line with global requirements to increase access to medicine globally. So all of these new types of data are really just one big triangulation exercise to help us understand what is a company saying about itself, but then also, is this good enough for what things look like today and global scenarios for the future?
So, Lise, how do these new types of data relate to key themes in sustainable finance? And those include, in addition to others, nature, biodiversity, and particularly net zero strategies for targets that companies are setting for the future?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the topics of nature and climate are really where this new evolution of data becomes the most interesting and the most useful to answer the types of questions we really need to answer on these topics. So I would go as far as to say that the old data, which was kind of backward-looking, only focused on company disclosures, at least in its old form, was not enough to let us answer the questions we need to know about nature and climate. If we start with nature, both nature impact and nature risk, so what happens to a company when they don't have access to water, physical climate risk, which is basically the risk that companies face from physical climate change like droughts and floods and storms. Both of these have one thing in common, which is that proper analysis is location, location, location. So to really understand the risk or the impact that a company is making, we need two new types of data. The one is asset level data. So this is literally the data sets that tell us the physical locations of companies' assets, where their production facilities are or where the farms are, for example. And this is literally latitude and longitude of different assets linked to their owners. This is a whole new, really interesting field of data. And then we need to have a whole range of different ecological maps, or something that tells us about the state of nature or the issues that we're trying to measure in those areas. So this could be maps of what water scarcity look like globally, or global emissions in real time, or deforestation or soil quality. And this allows us to answer questions like, if we have a energy utility that requires water for cooling, without which it can stop functioning, which has happened in India, it's happened in France. At best, this leads to loss of operations. At worst, it can lead to a national energy crisis. We don't only need to know that they think water is an important issue and they have a policy. We need to know that they understand where are their utilities located, and are these located in areas that are likely to run out of water either this year or in the future, and are they actually mitigating that location-based risk? So that's really an interesting part of analysis on the nature side. And then climate is really where the context and the forward-looking data comes in on the transition side. So this is about saying, we need to know, we're actually less interested today in a company's carbon footprint. It's still a very important metric, of course, that all investors care about, but we're actually more interested in about how is this company transitioning into the future, either its own business model or by creating products and services that help other companies or the wider economy decarbonize. And here we're interested in really other types of forward-looking metrics and context questions. So if we take the kind of new kid on the block in climate analysis is CapEx data, so a company's capital expenditure, which obviously investors have always had access to for other types of analysis, but now we're starting to answer new questions. So if I'm an automotive manufacturer, investors would want to know, what percentage of my capital expenditure am I building out on internal combustion engines versus electric vehicles? What is that proportion? And what does that mean for how my business model is shifting over time? Same for energy companies. What is the split between renewable and fossil fuels that they're building out over time? And this can really help us understand, one, are their actions in line with their commitments? We see really weird examples of companies with net zero commitments, but you look at what they're building out and it's going down a completely different track. But then we also still need to answer the context question of, even if a company is building out a lot of EVs or renewable energy, for example, we still need to answer, is this enough in terms of the global climate scenarios that we know different sectors need to go on in terms of technology transition? So those are just two examples of new, interesting, and much more useful questions we can answer with new data.
Okay, now we've mentioned that there is a current backlash, especially in the U.S., on a regulatory and even from a legal perspective, about the validity of ESG data and how it is used. So how can a more granular and transparent focus on ESG data rebuild trust amid this backlash?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because, obviously there were many dynamics behind the ESG backlash. Not all of them had to do with data, but certainly the evolution of ESG data has been a very big part of the story, because one of the reasons that stakeholders challenged trust in ESG in general, and we believe rightly so, was because, simply put, the claims that were being made were just bigger than reality. And a lot of that had to do with the data out there not really lending itself to investors really knowing how to check claims against reality. And so this includes a few things. There was greenwashing. Sustainability disclosures were such that investors were not really able to tell whether a company's disclosures are about actual action versus superficial claims. And that comes a little bit down to the data. So accountability in terms of how sustainability is defined. Previously, it has really been defined by kind of privatized definitions of sustainability in the form of ESG ratings, rather than publicly defined accountable definitions of what sustainability looks like, which would allow investors to compare claims. And then a lack of transparency. And this would have been the antidote, I guess, to lack of accountability and lack of comparability, because then at least investors could dig down and say, well, what is the data I'm actually looking at? What assumptions have been made here? How has this model worked? Do I agree with it? But because there hasn't been transparency, that has also been hard. And this has really, fueled the ESG backlash, at least from the data side, because the claims have been big. It was a third of global capital being managed under ESG strategies, but yet we weren't really seeing the parallel impact in the real world that we should be seeing if that was really managed to rigorous definitions of sustainability. But the flip side of that, obviously, is that ESG data now can help rebuild trust in ESG by basically working on exactly the issues where it was caught. And that is what we're seeing now. So we're seeing a much bigger focus on publicly accountable definitions of sustainability in the form of regulatory frameworks, in the form of tighter standards, both for companies in terms of their reporting and for investors. And these are largely kind of multi-stakeholder frameworks and standards, and then much more transparency in models. So this is really how Matter has always worked, but we believe an investor should always be able to unpack a certain insight and understand how has this insight been arrived at, what assumptions have been made, how has missing data been dealt with, what standards is it being held against. And this we believe will really, at least to the extent that greenwashing, lack of trust in claims was part of the backlash, good data may not be a sufficient condition, but it's certainly a necessary one to rebuild trust.
Now, the role of science-based and multi-stakeholder frameworks has been growing in importance, as you're suggesting. And it's also ensuring that sustainable finance and that community can effectively tackle issues like climate change and nature loss. Talk about that whole concept, and please integrate your experience of working with the World Wildlife Fund into this answer, if you will. Sure.
Yeah, this links very much to sort of, and sometimes I feel like a broken record with Matter also, is that we really do talk a lot about publicly accountable and science-based frameworks when analyzing sustainability, and it really comes down to if we just step back and think of climate and nature as issues, these are by definition science-based issues with science-based thresholds. Something like our global response to climate change, it's not about how much we think we can decarbonize as a society. We have a global carbon budget that is set for us by nature. Nature doesn't really care how much we think we can decarbonize. And these carbon budgets are associated with certain probabilities of reaching warming. We can't fight that. That is a science-based threshold. It's the same with land use change and deforestation. Once we reach a tipping point there, the Earth system will change. It's a nature-based, science-based boundary. Same with how much pollution and chemical pollution nature can integrate without being able to replenish itself. Again, a science-based boundary. So the idea of integrating science-based analysis is really about saying, it's not about what we think is enough or what we can do or what we can disclose. It's about going at it the other way around and saying, there are boundaries that we need to fit our economy into and transition our business models into, and how do we start understanding those boundaries and those pathways to those boundaries with different tools and frameworks. It's been interesting. I mean, I'm really glad to say now that the finance sector is really on board the importance of science-based expertise. So we see a lot of investors hiring climate scientists and biologists and geographers now, really in the recognition that this expertise is necessary. And that's, a big shift from 5 to 8 years ago when I was at WWF, Sustainable Finance Team in Singapore. Our role really was to take the expertise that was sitting in the global WWF network in terms of oceans and climate and forests, and translate that into what that means for banks and regulators and investors, and say, these are the issues, this is why it matters, these are the tools, methodologies, standards that are available to you. And we're really seeing that now become a lot more mainstream today.
So these lessons that we're learning now about how to use climate and biodiversity frameworks, can you give us a couple of examples of what's going on in that area these days regarding the not just the current ESG data that's being produced, but the future ESG data?
Yeah. So I would say all of the work that we at MAD are doing now, but also just the wider industry, I think is about making the distance shorter between claims and reality. So we are seeing investors be less and less interested in, very complicated black box methodologies that arrive at some conclusion just for the sake of having a conclusion, and more interested in really getting the full granularity and look through into the data, which may be harder to work with, but it gets us to a much more accurate picture of what's actually going on. So if we think of climate or nature, for example, an investor will now want to know, instead of just getting, this company is doing a AA on climate, it wants to get the full look through of where is there missing data, what are the nuances in the underlying data that might have been kind of rolled up through some assumptions in an ESG rating. An investor would want to see them side by side now to say, if there is a trade-off between climate impact and human rights impact, I want to see that in the underlying data and make the decision for myself of what to do with that. And then having much higher expectations of, I want to know where this data point came from, tracing it to origin, transparent treatment of methodologies. And then again, going on about accountability of models, when a claim is made, to be able to say, okay, well, this company is 20% aligned with climate solutions, and I can say that because it has 20% of revenue in electric vehicles, and electric vehicles have been classified as climate solutions by this framework. So really, auditability through the claims that are being made in frameworks, we're really seeing in climate and nature now, and I think will drive a lot of the data that we're seeing going forward and the other topics that we cover in ESG. And then the second thing is that, if we're thinking about the future of ESG, that's also very much driven by hopefully more data as companies start to disclose more, but also more and more being gathered and driven by AI and machine learning models. So we'll have more data, we'll also have faster lead times between company disclosures and when it gets in the hand of investors, and AI basically both gathering data and creating insights for us. But we don't want this to turn just into another black box problem. We need to make sure that as this happens, it's guided by the principles of transparency, public accountability, etc. And of course, we're also looking forward to the day where AI and more data availability also solve some of the problems that we've seen in especially the climate and nature space, which is comparability and coverage of data. So we'll see a lot of changes in the future.
So we've been talking about the investor part of that equation so far. What about the asset management part of that equation? What kind of feedback are you getting from asset management firms as they talk to their investors about the issues at hand?
Yeah. So we work with clients across the spectrum of the investment ecosystem, let's say. So we work with asset managers, institutional investors, also pension funds and different types of asset owners, and also investment consultants who play a very big role in where money is flowing. And then more and more also integrating our data into other platforms where financial decisions are being made. I think by and large, the feedback we're getting is the same. I mean, how I will summarize it is that clients are expecting or are becoming more mature in terms of ESG expectations and capabilities, and therefore want to use ESG data in a bit of a different way. We do see a little bit of a difference between our larger clients and smaller clients. Typically, larger clients have embedded huge ESG teams or large ESG teams. They have sophisticated data infrastructure internally. They're often getting data from multiple different sources. And what they want is really specific, rigorous data sets that are telling them something very specific and measurable about, for example, SDG alignment or climate alignment, that has nuances embedded that they can make their own models and choices internally. And then some of the smaller asset managers and investors that are sort of don't necessarily have huge teams are usually using our platform as a basically in-house ESG team to do some of the heavy lifting on portfolio analysis and looking at strategies and comparing against benchmarks and reporting, etc. But the common thread between all the stakeholders is really having higher expectations of ESG data for them to be basically just more transparent and more being able to trace down to the underlying decisions.
Okay. Well, Lise, thanks very much for your time today. And please tell our followers where online they can go to learn more about Matter and how they can contact you with questions about the topics that we've discussed in today's episode.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. Well, you can find us online at www.thisismatter.com. I hope I got that right. It's definitely This Is Matter. It is probably .com.
We'll check. We'll fact check you on that
one. And then we're on LinkedIn. We are on, and then we have a newsletter that you can sign up to, which we sort of give industry news and product updates, etc. And then anyone is welcome to connect with me personally on LinkedIn and send me a message if you have any specific questions.
Okay. Now, listen, if you have a link that you can provide for us to your newsletter or any other reports or documents that you think interested investors would be looking to review as well, please send those to us and we can attach them to the Bright Talk version of this program when we go public with it, when we drop it. So we would appreciate that kind of support as well. And we want to thank you again very much, Lise Pretorius, Chief Sustainability Analysis Officer at Matter, for joining me on today's program. And followers of the Sustainable Finance Podcast can join me again next week for our next episode. I'm Paul Ellis, and this is the Sustainable Finance Podcast.